The one issue that I've had before and have been asked about by folks is there a difference between legislative history and intent? It seems to me that a number of capital observers use the terms legislative history, statutory history, legislative intent kind of interchangeably, but these terms really do have different meanings. So, what are the distinctions between legislative history and intent? Well, legislative history relates to how a bill becomes law and includes the documents and the steps involved in the passage of that legislation and its ultimate enactment. On the other hand, legislative intent relates to why the bill became law, who proposed it for what reason, and primary documents involved in the legislative history can often illustrate legislative intent. Of course, seeking legislative intent is what the judicial branch and others often do in order to determine what the goal or purpose of the legislature was when they enacted the legislation that's in dispute. This requires, in the first place, a review and understanding of the plain language of the statute. So the term statutory history is usually defined as changes to the language of the bill through the legislative process, i.e., how the statutes by history was changed through the process. Again, like legislative history, statutory history is gleaned through how the bill language developed through the process. And sometimes individuals use the phrase legislative history, but they might actually mean either statutory or legislative history. So, what are some examples of legislative history? They include committee reports, statements of support or opposition from interested parties and groups, press releases, media articles, perhaps a signing or vetoing message by the chief executive, and of course, bill analyses written by committees, as well as analyses by other groups or the executive branch. Some examples of statutory history could include the drafting history, such as was the statute amended, and if so, how? What language came in? What language came out when reviewing the prior versions of the bill? In terms of the most persuasive legislative history to help ascertain legislative intent, some courts and legal commentators disagree, but the courts generally consider the best legislative history to be that which represents a large body of the legislature, generally the legislature as a whole, rather than just the bill's author or the supporters or opponents in the debate over the legislation. Legislative history is often challenging and controversial. While a statute is in the law, the history is not always clear, and it doesn't necessarily represent the entire legislature as a whole, because in most instances, there really isn't collective intent. In other words, not all legislators may have had the same idea in mind or even the same reason for voting to enact a bill. And to make matters worse, sometimes the legislative history can be general or vague or even unclear in certain circumstances. But nonetheless, you should be aware that the terms legislative history, statutory history, and legislative intent do in fact have different meanings, and we ought to use those different terms when we are discussing drafting of legislation and certainly the interpretation of legislation and statutes in the end.